The French Wars of Religion, lasting from 1562 to 1598, were a series of excruciatingly brutal conflicts in France, marked by intense religious and political strife between the Catholic majority and the Protestant Huguenots. This period featured several key events, including the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre of 1572, where thousands of Huguenots lost their lives. The wars reflected deeper power struggles within the French nobility, particularly among the Catholic Guises, Bourbons, and Montmorency Chatillons, who exploited religious divisions to enhance their power. The hostilities finally concluded with the Edict of Nantes in 1598, issued by Henry IV, which granted significant rights to the Huguenots, aiming to stabilize and unify France under a more tolerant and centralized regime. Hello there and welcome to the channel. If it's your first time here, it's good to meet you. And if you're coming back, it's good to see you again. As always, if you like what I do and want to support the channel, link to Patreon's in the description. Or, if you want to help me get to 6,000 subscribers, we are very close to getting there. Click that subscribe button and like the video to get YouTube into gear pushing it out. Now, without further ado, get yourself relaxed, take a very deep breath, and let's begin our full history of the French Wars of Religion. Let's try and trace the roots all the way back in the 14th century Italy. Renaissance humanism, emerging in 14th century Italy, reached France in the early 16th century, aligning with the rise of Protestantism. This movement stressed the importance of returning to the original sources, the ad fontes, initially concerning on reconstructing secular Greek and Latin texts. It did evolve to include the study of translation and New Testament and the Church Fathers' works, aiming for significant religious reform. Humanist scholars contended that biblical interpretation required knowledge of the original Greek and Hebrew, rather than relying solely on the Latin Vulgate Bible translation from the 4th century. In 1495, Aldus Manutius utilized the printing press, a new invention for Europe, to produce affordable, portable editions of literature in Greek, Latin, and of course vernacular languages, democratizing access to knowledge. By 1519, the impact of printing was evident as John Froben published and widely distributed Martin Luther's works, indicating the rapid dissemination of religious ideas. And if you want to know all about Martin Luther, I've got a video on him in the biographies playlist. By 1521, the Circle of Meaux, formed by reformers like Jacques Lefebvre and Guillaume Brissonnet, focused on enhancing preaching and general religious life. Notables such as François Vatable and Guillaume Boudet, with their expertise in Hebrew and classics, supported this initiative. Lefebvre's works pushed for a literal Bible interpretation and underscored Christ's centrality, aligning closely with Martin Luther's teachings. The circle also included Marguerite de Navarre and Guillaume Farel, who later influenced John Calvin in Geneva. Despite their eventual banishment from Geneva in 1538 over conflicts about government and ecclesiastical relations, Calvin returned in 1541, refining and firmly establishing Calvinism. Now, the Reformation was partly motivated by the clergy's corruption, which Luther vehemently criticized, a sentiment amplified by the printing press's ability to spread such critiques far and wide. For instance, Margaret's Heptameron highlighted clerical immorality, and Farel's writings on prayer challenged the clergy's role in obstructing genuine faith, emphasizing salvation as a divine gift and the importance of personal understanding in prayer. The revival of classical learning in Italy greatly influenced Francis I of France, who was drawn to ancient literature and subsequently established royal professorships in Paris. However, his enthusiasm for classical revival did not extend to religious reform. After the Concordat of Bologna in 1516, where Pope Leo X granted Francis increased control over the French Church, allowing him to appoint clergy and tax church property, the French king upheld the traditional religious structures, unlike the religious upheavals occurring in Germany. The French nobility, benefiting from the status quo, largely supported these existing arrangements. Despite personal reservations, Francis initially tolerated the spread of Martin Luther's ideas in France during the late 1520s, partly due to the ambiguity in defining Catholic orthodoxy at the time, which, more often than not, blurred the lines of heresy. Francis navigated a cautious path amidst emerging religious divisions. However, in January of 1535, Catholic authorities firmly categorized Lutherans alongside heretical Zwinglians, prompting John Calvin, a native of Noyon, Picardy, to flee France in 1535 due to increasing persecution. Settling in Basel, Calvin published his seminal Institutes of the Christian Religion in 1538, laying down the foundations of Calvinism, which quickly spread throughout France and beyond. Lutheranism found significant followers among the French commercial classes, but the nobility predominantly drove the swift expansion of Calvinism. Notably, Condé encountered Calvinism during a stop in Geneva upon returning from a military campaign, and was influenced by a sermon he heard there. Jeanne d'Albret, the Queen of Navarre, converted to Calvinism in 1560, influenced possibly by Theodore de Beze. Alongside Condé and her husband Antoine of Navarre, she and their son Henry of Navarre emerged as prominent Huguenot leaders. The French monarchy maintained a stance of neutrality in religious matters. That was until the affair of the placards in October 1534, a pivotal moment when Protestant radicals publicly denounced the Catholic belief in the Eucharist by posting placards in Paris and other cities, including one on the door of King Francis I's bedroom, reportedly. This blatant security breach, I don't know how they got in, and the content of the placards incited the king's anger and shifted Protestantism into the realm of very clearly defined heresy. Francis, criticized for his previous leniency, responded by executing those involved in the incident, on the 21st of February 1535 in a public display at Notre Dame de Paris, witnessed by both the king and the Ottoman embassy. That ought to impress the guests. The 1540s saw an intensified crackdown on Protestantism, pushing Protestant worship underground. In a notorious episode in October 1545, Francis ordered the brutal suppression of the Waldensians at Merindol, a village in southeastern France. This group, which had connections to proto-Protestantism dating back to the 13th century, and had recently aligned with the Reformed Church, was targeted for its increasing militancy. The ensuing massacre of Merindol led to the death of many villagers and widespread condemnation. Also the destruction of about 22 to 28 surrounding villages. And the men that survived were very unfortunately conscripted as galley slaves. Now, if you don't know what a galley slave is, the galley is the deck on a ship that has the rowing oars. So effectively, you're thrown down there in that hot, humid, sweaty compartment with 50 to 60 other guys, and you just have to row the boat all day. Not a good job. Now, Francis I passed away on the 31st of March, 1547, and his son, Henry II, ascended to the throne, continuing and intensifying his father's policies of religious repression. Believing firmly in the heretical nature of all Protestant beliefs, Henry enacted the Edict of Chateaubriand on the 27th of June, 1551, which significantly restricted Protestant worship and authorized the confiscation of property from those who were labeled as heretics. From his exile in Geneva, John Calvin became a pivotal figure in organizing and leading the Reformed Church of France. Calvinism appealed widely, crossing both social and occupational lines, and spread in a highly regionalized manner without a clear geographical pattern. Despite facing persecution, the number of Calvinists, including a significant portion of the French nobility, grew substantially. By the onset of the religious wars in 1562, historians estimate that France had around 2 million Calvinists, supported by 1,200 to 1,250 congregations, representing a formidable challenge to the French monarchy. Well, Henry wasn't around for too long. His sudden death in July of 1559 led to a power vacuum in France, which the adolescent Francis II struggled to manage. His uncle, the Duke of Guise, swiftly capitalized on this instability, leveraging his familial ties. He was the uncle of Francis II's wife, Mary, Queen of Scots, to dominate the royal court. Within days of Francis II's coronation, the English ambassador noted the overwhelming influence of the Guise family at court. In a bold move on the 10th of March 1560, a faction of discontented nobles led by Jean de Barry plotted to abduct the young king to diminish the Guises' control. The plot, however, was uncovered before it could be executed, leading to severe repercussions, including the execution of de Barry and the many alleged conspirators. The Guise family also had suspected Louis I of Bourbon, the Prince of Condé, of involvement, leading to his arrest and a subsequent death sentence. However, he was later freed amid the chaos following Francis II's unexpected death in December of 1560. Very lucky for him. This period also saw the rise of the term Huguenot to describe French Protestants. Following incidents of Protestant iconoclasm in cities like Rouen and La Rochelle during 1561. These acts of iconoclasm, involving the destruction of Catholic imagery, led to retaliatory violence against Protestants across France. Upon the death of Francis II on the 5th of December 1560, his mother, Catherine de' Medici, assumed the regency for her younger son, Charles IX. With the kingdom financially depleted by the Italian wars, Catherine aimed to balance the competing noble factions. She navigated the politics by securing the release of Condé in exchange for Antoine of Navarre's withdrawal from a claim to the regency. Catherine had faced considerable challenges in addressing religious tensions. Options included continuing her husband's harsh suppression of Protestantism, or simply adopting Protestantism to appease the rising Calvinist forces within the kingdom. Ultimately, she opted for the moderate path, slightly easing persecution without fully embracing Protestant demands for full religious freedom. This moderate stance was reflected in her handling of the Estates General convened in December 1560, which failed to resolve religious disputes, but did agree on pardons for past religious offences. Catherine further sought to placate religious tensions by issuing the Edict of Saint-Germain in 1562, granting limited rights to Protestant worship, and I use the term limited. However, this very fragile peace was shattered when the Duke of Guise forces massacred Protestant worshippers in Vassy on the 1st of March 1562, and this was the event that really ignited the French wars of religion. Took us a while to get there, but the background is important. Now, the situation in regions like Guyenne became increasingly volatile, with figures such as Jean d'Albret and Antoine of Navarre influencing the rise of Calvinism among the nobility, marking a region a focal point for religious conflict. While traditional explanations for the escalation of violence in Guyenne have emphasized the socio-economic factors and influence of radical preachers, like Thomas Illyricus, recent scholarship has highlighted the politicization of religious divisions as a primary catalyst for the violent outbreaks that characterized the late 16th century France. The initial mobilization of the Huguenots prior to the Vassy massacre intensified following the violent event, affirming their fears that they could not depend on the Edict of Saint-Germain for protection. In a defiant response, led by Condé, a group of Protestant nobles took decisive action by capturing Orléans on the 2nd of April 1562, signaling the start of open rebellion. This action set off a chain reaction, with Protestant forces quickly seizing control of key cities along the Loire, such as Angers, Blois, and Tours, and even attacking Valence in the Rhône. The situation escalated further when Lyon was overtaken on the 30th of April. The city's Catholic institutions were not only looted, but also destroyed. In Toulouse, efforts by the local Huguenots to align the city with Condé sparked violent confrontations with Catholic residents, leading to street battles and a death toll of over 3,000, predominantly Huguenots. Similarly, massacres targeting Huguenots occurred in Sens on the 12th of April and Tours in July. As violence surged, the crown, influenced by the Guise faction, rescinded the Edict of Saint-Germain. The conflict then saw significant battles at Rouen, Dreux, and Orléans. During the siege of Rouen, from May to October 1562, the crown forces retook the city, though it was at the cost of Antoine of Navarre's life due to wounds. The Battle of Dreux in December saw the capture of both Condé by royal forces and Montmorency by the opposing side. The siege of Orleans in February of 1563 culminated in the assassination of Francis, Duke of Guise, by Jean de Poltrot de Mere, sparking further unrest and leading Catherine de' Medici to negotiate the Edict of Amboise on the 19th of March 1563, which ended the siege but didn't manage to satisfy either party. Continuing tensions and the perceived inadequacy of the Edict of Amboise prompted Catherine to focus on consolidating royal authority. This effort included the recapture of Le Havre from the English control, following its occupation under the terms of the Treaty of Hampton Court with Elizabeth I of England. With the English expelled in July 1563, Charles IX was declared of age in August, formally ending Catherine's regency, although she did remain very influential. Between 1564 and 66, Charles and Catherine conducted a grand tour of France to reinforce the royal authority. During this period, Catherine and Jean d'Albret engaged in negotiations that somewhat failed to ease the religious tensions. The iconoclasm in Flanders and the strategic military positioning of Spanish forces under Philip II heightened the French Protestant fears of renewed Catholic aggression. Discontent led to the Surprise of Meaux, an unsuccessful Protestant attempt to seize Charles. In reaction, cities like La Rochelle joined the Protestant cause, and significant violence against Catholics occurred, such as the Michelade in Nimes. These events precipitated the Second Religious War, marked by the Battle of Saint-Denis, where Montmorency was killed. The conflict continued with the Peace of Longjumeau in March of 1568, which briefly reinstated the concessions of the Edict of Amboise. However, the deep-seated hostilities were so entrenched that even after the truce was declared, the siege of the Protestant stronghold, Puy-Lorenz, continued for an additional week, illustrating the persistent and bitter divisions. Following the Peace of Longjumeau, Catholic groups throughout France openly defied the conciliatory measures by forming confraternities and leagues in the summer of 1568. The escalating tension prompted Huguenot leaders like Condé and Coligny to flee the court, fearing for their safety, as many of their adherents faced violence and murder. The situation managed to worsen in September, when the Edict of St. Maur severely restricted Huguenot freedoms, essentially revoking their right to worship completely. Well, they weren't going to take that sitting down, so it all led to further strife. In November, William of Orange entered France with an army to aid the Protestants. However, struggling with financial issues, he negotiated with the French crown, accepting money and safe passage out of the country in return for withdrawing his forces. I suppose everybody has their price. Meanwhile, the Huguenots, undeterred, rallied a substantial force under Condé, with additional support from southern French forces led by Paul de Morvan's and German Protestant militias, including 14,000 raiders commanded by the Calvinist Duke of Zweibrücken. After the Duke's death in battle, his troops continued to fight under the Huguenot banner, funded in part by a loan secured by Jean d'Albret's crown jewels, and substantial financial support from Queen Elizabeth of England, influenced heavily by Sir Francis Walsingham. The Catholic forces, under the future King Henry III, then Duke of Anjou, were reinforced by troops from Spain, the Papal States, and Tuscany. This formidable alliance faced the Protestants as they laid siege to cities like Poitiers, Saintonge, to secure Rochelle, followed by assaults on Angoulême and Cognac. This conflict reached a critical point at the Battle of Jarnac on the 16th of March 1569, where Condé was killed, leaving Admiral de Coligny to lead the Protestant forces. Coligny's leadership extended to protecting the young Henry of Condé and Henry of Navarre, both presented by Jean d'Albret as the rightful Huguenot leaders. Despite a minor victory at La Roche-la-Belle, the Huguenots failed to capture Poitiers and suffered a major defeat at Moncontour on the 30th of October 1569. Coligny then led a strategic retreat to the southwest, where he joined forces with Gabriel, Comte de Montgomery. In the spring of 1570, they launched a devastating raid through southern France, reaching as far as La Charité-sur-Loire. The extensive military campaigns, coupled with the burgeoning royal debt and Charles IX's inclination towards a peaceful resolution, culminated in the Peace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye on the 8th of August 1570. This agreement, largely negotiated by Jean d'Albret, reinstated certain freedoms to the Huguenots, marking yet another attempt to quell the religious strife that had already deeply scarred France. Following St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, the French monarchy pursued a strategy aimed at national reconciliation, focusing significantly on a matrimonial alliance between the Protestant and Catholic nobility. This was embodied in the proposed marriage between Henry of Navarre, son of Jean d'Albret and the Protestant king Antoine of Navarre, and Margaret of Valois, the Catholic sister of King Charles IX. Despite Jean d'Albret's reservations about potential religious compromises, the marriage contract was finalized in March of 1572. Now, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a prominent Huguenot leader who had been marginalized during the Civil War, saw his fortunes reversed with the Peace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Welcomed warmly at the royal court in the August of 1571, Coligny used his reinstated position to advocate for a French intervention in the Spanish Netherlands, aiming to unify Catholics and Huguenots against a common enemy. However, the French council, including King Charles IX, was reluctant to provoke a direct conflict with Spain, leading to Coligny's departure from court due to its reportedly unwelcoming atmosphere. The August of 1572 wedding of Navarre and Margaret in Paris was another significant event, drawing many high-ranking Huguenots to the city. Days after the wedding, an assassination attempt on Coligny escalated tensions, with Huguenot nobles suspecting involvement by the House of Guise, and of course demanding justice, a justice that Charles promised they would have. Fearing the potential for a potential Protestant retaliation or civil war, the royal court, under Catherine de' Medici's influence, decided to eliminate the Huguenot leadership preemptively. In the early hours of the 24th of August, 1572, organized groups, including one led by the Duke of Guise, murdered Coligny and other Huguenot leaders. These killings ignited widespread violence across Paris and subsequently other French cities, with thousands of Huguenots massacred over several days. The official narrative framed the massacre as a preemptive action against a purported Huguenot coup, leading to celebrations by figures like Philip II of Spain and Pope Gregory XIII, who viewed it as a thwarting of Protestant sedition. Well, the massacre severely weakened the Huguenot political force, prompting many to emigrate or convert to Catholicism out of survival, while there were others who consolidated in strongholds like La Rochelle, but the majority of them chose to keep their heads down. Despite the brief military responses that followed, including the sieges by Catholic forces, the subsequent Edict of Boulogne in 1573 curtailed Huguenot freedoms significantly. This edict limited Protestant worship to private residences within only 3 cities and restricted public religious ceremonies. In the turmoil following the death of Charles IX in the May of 1574, and with the Duke of Anjou, recently crowned King of Poland, absent, the French court was engulfed in yet another power struggle. The Duke of Alençon, Charles's youngest brother, became a center of patronage for the Huguenots, who rallied around him. The failed coup of Saint-Germain in February 1574, which aimed to liberate the imprisoned Huguenots' leaders, Condé and Navarre, coincided with a successful Protestant uprising in regions like Lower Normandy and the Rhone Valley, once again reigniting the French wars of religion. 3 months after Henry of Anjou's coronation as King of Poland, Charles IX passed away, prompting Henry's covert departure from Poland and return to France. Upon his return, he confronted the defection of the Montmorency Damville, and was crowned King Henry III in February 1575. Amidst these challenges, the escape of Alençon from court in September of 1575 threatened to consolidate opposition forces against the monarchy. The Crown, seeking stability, hastily negotiated a truce with Alençon and the invading forces of John of Casimir of the Palatinate, even promising a large sum to deter their further advances. By May 1576, Henry III was compelled to agree to the Edict of Beaulieu, or the Peace of Massacre, granting substantial concessions to the Huguenots. However, the peace was short-lived due to the formation of the Catholic League by the ultra-Catholic Duke of Guise, a staunch defender of Roman Catholicism, along with his relatives who wielded significant territorial influence. The League quickly garnered support among the urban middle classes. King Henry III initially attempted to control the Catholic League, aiming for a negotiated peace. However, his efforts were thwarted by the Guises, who preferred a more aggressive approach. The conflict came to a head during the Estates General at Blois in December of 1576, where the predominantly Catholic Assembly pressured the king to renew hostilities against the Huguenots, yet refused to fund the war. The inability of the Estates General to resolve these tensions led to the Huguenots taking up arms again by the end of 1576. Despite the Guise faction's support from the Spanish crown, the Huguenots managed a strong base in the southwest and had covert support from foreign Protestant states, although practical military aid was limited. This stalemate led Henry III to retract many of the Edict of Beaulieu's concessions with the Treaty of Bergerac in September 1577, reaffirmed shortly afterward by the Edict of Poitiers. This ongoing discord saw Henry's brother, the Duke of Anjou, continuously involved in disruptive activities, particularly through his participation in the Dutch Revolt. This period was marked by widespread arming among both Catholics and Protestants, ostensibly for self-defense, leading to further regional instability. The cycle of conflict persisted until the Treaty of Flakes in November of 1580, negotiated by Anjou, which halted the fighting, albeit temporarily. The delicate balance in French politics unraveled rapidly following the death of the Duke of Anjou in 1584. As King Henry III had no direct heirs, the line of succession pointed to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant, under Salic law pretenses. The potential accession of a Protestant king alarmed the Catholic factions, leading to the Treaty of Joinville between the Duke of Guise and Philip II of Spain. This treaty ensured Spanish financial support for the Catholic League, aiming to continue the Civil War and suppress Protestant influence in France. Faced with intense pressure from the Catholic League and lacking adequate funds, Henry III was compelled to issue the Treaty of Nemours in July of 1585, which not only suppressed Protestantism, but also disqualified Henry of Navarre from succession. Of course, this act of obvious suppression led to immediate warfare, with Navarre seeking assistance from Protestant powers like Elizabeth I of England and various German princes to support his cause. The political climate in Paris grew increasingly volatile, culminating in the Day of the Barricades on the 12th of May 1588. The Parisians rose up, barricading the streets to protect the Duke of Guise from perceived royal hostility, forcing Henry III to flee from the capital. The control of Paris fell to the Committee of 16, who imposed almost complete control over the government in favor of the Catholic League. In a desperate bid to regain authority, Henry III convened the Estates General at Blois. However, the situation escalated when Henry, suspecting the Guise of inciting the Duke of Savoy's invasion and manipulating the Estates General, decided to eliminate the Guise threat. The 23rd of December, 1588, in a dramatic confrontation at the Château de Blois, the Duke of Guise and his brother, the Cardinal, were assassinated by royal guards. This bold action, however, had a dramatic backfire. The Duke's popularity made him a martyr for the Catholic cause, and the Catholic League, led by the Duke's brother, the Duke of Mayenne, intensified its opposition. The Sorbonne even declared it just and necessary to depose Henry, legitimizing regicide. In July of 1589, the conflict reached its peak when a Dominican friar assassinated Henry III at St. Cloud. On his deathbed, Henry named Henry of Navarre as his successor, urging him to convert to Catholicism to avoid further conflict. Though Navarre promised to uphold the Catholic faith, his Protestant background made his succession controversial among Catholics. In 1589, France was once again starkly divided along religious lines following the death of Henry III. Henry IV, a Protestant, controlled southern and western France, while the Catholic League, led by the Duke of Mayenne as Lieutenant General, dominated the north and the east, including a significant part of rural Normandy. Early in his reign, Henry IV aimed to consolidate his rule by taking Paris, the stronghold of the Catholic League, which was fiercely resistant to a Calvinist king. Thus, Henry IV's campaign began with a strategic victory at the Battle of Arques in September 1589, followed by a series of successful military engagements that allowed him to sweep through Normandy. Despite the Catholic League's efforts to vilify Henry by spreading tales of Protestant atrocities in England, Henry continued his push towards Paris. The pivotal Battle of Ivry on the 14th of March 1590 marked yet another significant victory for Henry, bolstering his forces to besiege Paris. However, the siege was a grueling affair. Despite the Parisians' desperate resistance, it was ultimately lifted by the intervention of a Spanish army led by the Duke of Parma. This pattern repeated in Rouen, where, after initial setbacks, the siege was lifted in early 1592 due to Spanish intervention. The Duke of Parma, a formidable opponent, was later neutralized as a threat when he was wounded and withdrew to Flanders, falling ill and dying in December of the same year. Parallel to these events, Philippe Emmanuel, Duke of Mercoeur, and a leader within the Catholic League, sought to carve out an independent domain in Brittany. Leveraging his wife's hereditary claims, he declared his son as the Prince and Duke of Brittany, and aligned with Philip II of Spain, aiming to place the Spanish Infanta on the Brittany throne. Despite initial successes, including a victory at the Battle of Créon in 1592, Mercoeur's forces were eventually overwhelmed by combined Franco-English efforts. In a significant engagement in November of 1594, English forces led by Martin Frobisher and John Norris captured the strategically crucial Fort Crozon near Brest, dealing a critical blow to the Spanish and League ambitions in the area. Throughout these chaotic years, Henry IV faced not only military challenges, but also the formidable task of navigating the complex politics of a France deeply divided by religious conflicts. His strategic alliances and military victories gradually solidified his position, moving France towards a semblance of unity and stability under his rule. After years and years of relentless conflict, and with Paris remaining resolutely Catholic, Henry IV realized that his Protestant faith was a significant barrier to securing his reign. In a pragmatic shift aimed at solidifying his control, he converted to Catholicism in 1593, famously justifying his decision by remarking, "Paris is well worth a Mass." His conversion facilitated his coronation at Chartres in 1594, as the traditional coronation site in Reims was still under the control of League members, who doubted his sincerity and continued to resist him. Nonetheless, Henry's formal acceptance into the Catholic Church in March of 1594, and his subsequent entry into Paris marked a turning point, leading to the capitulation or reconciliation of many other towns. Even the Pope, Clement VIII, formally absolved Henry, lifting his excommunication in exchange for Henry's commitments to enforce the Tridentine decrees, restore Catholicism in Béarn, and appoint only Catholics to high offices. Well, despite these concessions, Henry's conversion raised concerns among Protestant nobles who had hoped for more significant religious reforms, rather than a mere tolerance under a Catholic boot. Their support for Henry, now complicated by his apparent shift in religious allegiance, was not guaranteed. In 1595, with the internal religious conflicts still simmering in the pan, and external threats from Spain exploiting all of these divisions, Henry IV decided to declare war on Spain. This move was strategically aimed at demonstrating to both Catholics and Protestants that his conversion had not made him a Spanish puppet, and that Spain was using religion to undermine French sovereignty. The conflict, known as the War with Spain, creative name, I know, stretched from 1595 until the signing of the Peace of Vervins in 1598. During this period, Henry aimed to reclaim territories controlled by Spanish-backed Catholic forces, engaging in significant battles such as the capture of Amiens after a lengthy siege in 1597. Concurrently, the situation in Brittany needed a resolution. In early 1598, Henry personally led a campaign against the Duke of Mercoeur, a prominent leader of the Catholic League in Brittany, who capitulated in March 1598. This victory, followed by Mercoeur's exile and the strategic marriage of his daughter to Henry's illegitimate son, the Duke of Vendôme, helped secure Brittany and further consolidate Henry's power. The Edict of Nantes, promulgated in April of 1598, marked the formal end of the Wars of Religion. It granted substantial rights to the Huguenots, establishing a form of civil unity that was less about genuine religious tolerance and more of a pragmatic truce between the faiths. While the edict was a pivotal step in restoring peace and promoting civil unity, it was met with resistance in some quarters, necessitating Henry's personal intervention at the Parliament to ensure its passage in January 1599. Henry IV's reign was then characterized by efforts to rebuild and unify a fractured and impoverished kingdom, with the support of his chief advisor, the Duke of Sully. Despite the relative peace and the formal end of the religious wars, tensions lingered, influencing French politics for years to come. Henry's rule, however, was rather rudely interrupted by his assassination in the May of 1610. Now, this Edict of Nantes, established in 1598, marked a significant milestone in French history, providing substantial rights and protections to the Huguenots. However, these concessions were perceived by some as creating a state within a state, increasingly became a source of friction throughout the 17th century. The demographic impact of sustained conflicts and emigration was notable, with the Huguenot community declining from 10% to 8% of France's population. The reign of Louis VIII saw ongoing tensions and conflict related to these freedoms. In an effort to assert Catholic dominance, Louis decided to reintroduce Catholicism to certain regions, which of course triggered a Huguenot uprising. The resulting Peace of Montpellier in 1622 drastically reduced the number of fortified Protestant towns to just 2, being La Rochelle and Montauban. This was followed by another war and the significant siege of La Rochelle in 1627–28, where royal forces under Cardinal Richelieu conducted a grueling blockade lasting 14 months. The siege finally ended in 1629 with the Peace of La Rochelle, which, while revoking the military and pastoral privileges granted by the Edict of Nantes, left the Huguenots' religious freedoms intact. Now, during the minority of Louis XIV and throughout the remainder of Louis XIII's reign, the enforcement of the edict varied, reflecting the fluctuating religious and political situation in the region. By 1661, Louis XIV began to exert greater personal control over his government, and increasingly neglected the edict's provisions. His hostility towards Huguenots intensified, culminating in 1681 with the implementation of the Dragonnades policy. This policy aimed to coerce Huguenot families into converting to Roman Catholicism, or emigrating through the billeting of dragoons, who would intimidate and harass them. The situation for the Huguenots became dire in 1685, when Louis XIV formally revoked the Edict of Nantes through the Edict of Fontainebleau, marking Protestantism as something illegal in France. This revocation forced many Huguenots to flee France for more tolerant nations, such as England, Brandenburg Prussia, the Dutch Republic, Switzerland, and, of course, the Americas, significantly depleting France's industrial and intellectual resources. Despite the official suppression of Protestantism, significant numbers of Huguenots remained, particularly in the isolated Cevennes region of the massive Central. Known as the Camisards, these Protestants openly revolted against the government in 1702, resulting in a protracted conflict known as the Camisard Revolt, which lasted for 13 years, finally ending in 1715. This rebellion was characterized by guerrilla warfare and severe repression, eventually winding down when the government largely ceased its active pursuit of the Camisards, allowing them to finally live in relative peace. And we have now reached our end of our lecture on the French Wars of Religion. Did you enjoy it? I hope you did. I'd like to thank my top-tier patrons, Stark Factory, JC, Jeffrey, and Susan. Thank you very much for supporting the channel. If you would like to support the channel, Patreon link is in the description. Otherwise, if you've gotten this far, I'm sure you've already subscribed. Not many people get this far. Thank you very much, esteemed listener, and I'll see you in the next video. Good night, everyone.